Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the committee's 35th meeting in 2019. Could I ask you all, please, to make sure your mobile phones are on silent? The first item on the agenda is the Agriculture Retained EU Law and Data Scotland Bill. And before we go any further, I'm going to invite members to declare any relevant interests they have. But before I do, I'm going to declare myself that I am a member of a family farming partnership. Peter.
Likewise, Convener, I am a member of a farming partnership as well.
And Stuart.
Joint owner of a very small registered agricultural holding from which I derive no income.
Okay, this is the committee's fifth evidence panel on the bill, and today we're going to take evidence from agricultural industry representatives. And I'd like to welcome the panel today, which is Johnny Hall, the Director of Policy from NFU Scotland, Lizzie Baxter, NFU Scotland Next Generation representative from the NFUS Next Generation Committee, Yvonne White, Chair of the Scottish Crofting Federation, Christopher Nicholson, Chairman of the Scottish Tenant Farmers Association, and Eleanor Kay, Policy Advisor on Agriculture and Forestry to the Scottish Land and Estates. Now, just before we go to questions, I know you are all practiced at giving evidence, and you've been told that the buttons will be pushed for you when you indicate you want to speak. I always say that if everyone looks away at the same time, then the last person to look away will be the person who has to answer the question. But there's no point saying that today because Johnny Hall never looks away and always tries to get in first. So you're quite safe. But if you want to come in, just try and catch my eye and I'll bring you in. And my other comment would be is once you start speaking, don't then look away because there may come a time when I'm trying to move somebody else in and indicate that you're coming to the end of your time on that. So the first question this morning is going to come from Peter Chapman. Peter.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel, and welcome to the committee this morning. The Scottish Government position is for a period of stability and simplicity, basically running until 2024, when minor things might change, but not a lot might change. But do you believe that this transition period is the correct way forward, and do you feel that this legislation reflects this approach?
Who'd like to head off on that? Now, there's a surprise. You head off on that one.
I wouldn't like to disappoint the convener.
You never do.
I think first and foremost this bill is absolutely necessary, and I think that's widely accepted. We do need this bill to provide the continuity element of the stability and simplification or simplicity agenda that the Scottish Government have set out. Therefore, we absolutely welcome this bill. It will provide a degree of certainty in the short to medium term. But the bill is all about enabling. It's all about providing powers to Scottish ministers. The bill in itself does not set policy, and I guess that's where there's a bit of a grey area between this bill and what future policy might look like or what it should look like. And therefore, I view this particular bill as something of a very important stepping stone. It's not where we finally need to be, but is very, very important in the interim. Particularly now that it would appear almost certain that we're going to leave Europe on the 31st of January with an increasingly likely implementation or transition period to the end of next year. Therefore, from January 2021, we absolutely need legislation in place which enables Scottish Government to continue to do the things that we currently do in terms of current cap schemes and making payments, but equally to start to tweak those cap schemes and the rules to provide some sort of simplification, and for Scottish ministers to then start the process of developing future policy through the pilots to 2024. I think Peter Chapman's question relates to the sort of, is this far enough, is this fast enough in terms of policy requirements for the industry? We've got serious concerns that it isn't, because we view the next decade for Scottish agriculture as being extremely challenging, not only in terms of underpinning the growing food and drink sector, but equally, very importantly, in terms of tackling major issues such as climate change and what Scottish agriculture will be requested to do or required to do over the next decade. So there's a strong argument that we need things to happen sooner rather than later in terms of fundamental change in how we underpin farming and crofting in Scotland. And therefore, there is a debate to be had about whether this is moving fast enough.
I mean, that's kind of where I was following on from that. Is the question is exactly as you've said, Johnny. There is a danger that if we don't change much more quickly between now and 2024, that we could leave the industry in quite a difficult position for the major change that we know is coming down the road because of Brexit and because of climate change, for instance, for just two issues.
Everyone's now sort of indicating they want to come in and say, I'm going to bring Eleanor, Christopher and Yvonne in, and Lizzie, you may come in at the end if you want to add. So, Eleanor.
Yeah, no, this bill sort of certainly provides that the ability to simplify and keep things stable, but you're exactly right that the point of the transition is that we know what we're moving towards, and whilst we know we can pilot within this bill, we have no sort of clear defining sort of guide as to what it is we need to be testing and trying out. We don't know where we're going. We've probably got a bit more certainty as to the fact that we most likely or most certainly will be leaving the EU, and we've got some pretty strong campaign promises from the current government as to future funding and guarantees to that. So we probably have more certainty than we did when this was written, and we're in a slightly different situation to what we were in when Stability and Simplicity as a consultation was put out. The climate change or the climate emergency hadn't been declared. We hadn't started that conversation, which has moved on so quickly that perhaps it needs looking at again. But equally, we don't know what those simplifications are going to be. We haven't had a report yet from the Simplification Task Force, which makes it quite tricky to know what these modifications could be that are now possible within this bill.
Christopher, do you want to come in?
The bill appears to be fit for purpose and necessary to allow the continuation of EU law and to maintain and amend it. There is, as Johnny Hall said, a lack of future policy, but I think at this stage it may be difficult to decide future policy, given that there isn't not yet a UK-wide framework. And also we don't know the nature of future trade deals with the EU and other trading partners that may well set standards and how future policy may be implemented. But it's vital for a transition period to have this bill in place, and it looks as though it would is sufficient for that. I think there are some questions and concerns as to the extent that this bill may be used to make significant changes to policy without scrutiny of Parliament or wider stakeholders. But I don't think that's what it's meant for.
I think we'll come on to that specific point later, but thank you for flagging that.
Can I just ask Christopher to comment a bit more on, do you feel that the fact that nothing much is going to change till 2024, do you think that's the correct way forward? Or do you feel, as I feel, that we need to move more quickly than that? Or what's your thoughts?
Well, my understanding was 2024 is not set in stone. We do need a transition period, but 2024 is 5 years away, and I agree that we may need to move quicker than that with new policy. Maybe some of that change can be achieved through this bill.
Okay.
The bill appears to be a bridge to bring back the EU legislation and to hold it, I understand, within the Scottish Government. It's the next step that appears to will be the most interesting one, because we need this bill in order to get a fit-for-purpose agricultural policy. To pick up Peter's point about stability and simplicity, it would appear to be a contradiction in terms. How can you have how can you make something simple yet have stability? I don't know, maybe someone somewhere can throw some light, it's understanding my way on that one. And in terms of, you mentioned about timeframes, I think it's actually imperative that the Scottish Government needs to be fleet of foot, and anything that is put in place, it needs to be robust. And to bring up the point that Eleanor made about, is the simplicity and stability, is it robust enough? I think a lot of work needs to be done quite quickly, and I appreciate that the civil servants, etc., are probably up and over their ears with work because of this Brexit business, but that we are in danger, or there is a danger, though there's opportunities, because you have the opportunity to carve something out that is more progressive, modern, up to date, that fits the different constituency agricultural parts of Scotland. So on one hand, this is a great opportunity if people are brave and creative enough to take it, whilst on the other hand there is also the threats. The threats, as Christopher mentioned, about trading terms, etc.
Lizzie, do you want to come in, or are you...
Just briefly, just to say that with what the panel is saying, I completely concur with it all. Johnny, you know, everything, all his points, I pretty much concur with everything that he was saying.
Okay. Mike, I think one of the points raised there might help you.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, I'm very supportive of the bill itself, and I think everybody is. It's a transition period we're talking about with this bill till we get to the meat of the new bespoke policy for Scotland. But our job is to interrogate this bill, and I want to focus absolutely on section 3, which says the Scottish ministers may, by regulations, that's not primary legislation, by regulations modify the main cap legislation with the purpose of securing that the provisions of the legislation continue to operate in relation to Scotland for 1 or more years beyond 2020. Now, John Kerr, Head of Agricultural Policy for the Scottish Government, said to us in his evidence session that, quote, "We have not included an end date because we don't yet know when we'll be in a position to have our new primary legislation in place." My concern is, and other witnesses in previous sessions, which I'm sure you've seen, is that if we don't modify this section 3 and put an end date to it, or possibly an end date to it, then the danger is the wheels of government and the wheels of Parliament will very slowly. And if we don't put an end date for this transition period, we could be going for years into a transition period, because that's what this law will allow. What do we think of that?
Christopher, you brought that up, and then I'm going to bring Eleanor in, and then Johnny.
Well, I can see that the bill could possibly be, for want of a better word, misused for that purpose, to continue making policy changes for a long period without consultation. But I don't think that's the purpose of the bill. The purpose is to allow continuation for the transition period. But I imagine that for stakeholders that there may be reassurance if there was, for example, reading the bill. I'm not sure if just one example, whether there is any limit on the transfer of funding from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. Now that would be a massive change in policy if significant funds were transferred from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2. And I'm not a lawyer, but I don't know whether there's a limit in the bill for that.
So you seem to be very good at picking up points that other people are going to raise. So we'll leave the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 payments. And I'm going to bring Eleanor in, and then Johnny.
No, you're absolutely right. We certainly share the concerns of other stakeholders that this is a unlimited duration sort of bill. The ability to continue essentially papering over the cracks is quite a concern when we look at the recommendations recently from the Committee on Climate Change, that we need to move quickly. We need transformational change, and continuing to make minor modifications to retained law doesn't really allow us to do that. I'm not sure whether you would want to put 2024 as a date in, committing yourself to just a 5-year timescale, but something that certainly had an end point or a point of review would definitely be welcome.
Johnny.
Obviously, the notion of some sort of sunset clause, which is what we're talking about here, would be, I think, advantageous, but I think it needs to be thought out very carefully, because it depends where you might set that. If you put a finite limit on those powers, say to the end of 2022, that would require a significant amount of work to be done and put in place to ensure that we do have not only a policy direction for Scottish agriculture agreed, but also fundamentally the measures and the administration systems around that in place to then be effective. Now, I think we need to be very, very careful. We all aspire to a new agricultural policy. We're all hungry for that change to happen in order to meet the challenges that we absolutely do face over the next decade. But we need to be careful to ensure that its implementation is going to be, to use Christopher's expression, fit for purpose as well. We don't want to fall out of the continuity and certainty we would have under the bill's provisions to then find ourselves in a situation whereby future schemes and so on aren't ready or enabled to operate in practice. And that would leave us in a very, very tricky situation indeed. But the notion of actually putting something in place that would require change sooner rather than later, rather than it being open-ended, is something we would very much support. In my opening comments, I raised the question of whether this goes far enough, but equally, does it go fast enough? My biggest concern is 2030. 2030 is a decade away. We all know that. A decade in farming and crofting terms is nothing at all. If we're going to meet the challenges that are being, we have to stand up and address, then we need to be given the tools to do so, and that requires significant change from the current policy regime we operate under.
Right.
Yeah, could I go on to ask then, the bill itself, and this is where we have touched on this, gives Scottish ministers powers to simplify and improve the operation of the CAP. That's what we're all interested in seeing. But the point is, what one person's simplification and improvement may be not somebody else's idea of simplification and improvement, because again, looking at the terms of what's in front of us at the bill, which we have to approve, it says the Scottish ministers may, by regulations, modify the main CAP legislation. And the whole point of that question in the law is, what does this enable the Scottish ministers to do? And this is the worry that I'm certainly articulating. I mean, I'm very supportive of the government's bill, and I'm very supportive of the policy intention. But any future government, the next elections are in 2021, this bill, in my view, and I'd like to hear your comments on it, may allow a future government to actually operate a new system according to the law that we're about to pass. And that's my concern. Is that shared or not?
Yvonne, do you want to come in? Because you wanted to answer, I think, the previous question bit as well, so
Yes,
I'll let you tie them together.
I'm behind. With regards to an end date, rather than the bill, as you point out, that it's in perpetuity as it stands under Section 3, that there's a fine line, because it's necessary to have this bill, but there are concerns that it's not in perpetuity. But then I can see the difficulty in putting a date, because there's that many external factors at play. So there possibly there's lawyers, constitutional lawyers, that have got some very clever caveats that they can place in there that would give comfort to people with regards to an expiry date.
Mm-hmm. Can I just add to that? Because basically what we're actually, so there's no misunderstanding, what we're talking about in legislative terms is, if a date, say somebody, or even the minister, anybody produced an amendment to this to limit it to 2024, it's not limiting the policies of 2024. What it is actually saying is that the government must bring forward legislation by 2024 for a new system. So Johnny talked about 10 years, but what we're talking about here is the view that 2024 should be in the bill so that the government, whichever government of the day it is, can come forward and say, this is now the legislation which we're consulting with stakeholders and Parliament for the new system that everybody hopefully will agree to. That's the point. It's not saying that the new system has to be in place by 2024.
There does need to be a timetable. Everything needs to have a timetable if it's to be delivered and to be effective, and that this needs to be delivered in order to get to the next stage of creating a new agricultural policy for Scotland.
Can I just add to that? If we're talking about bringing forward legislation by such a date, and legislation to be enacted by such a date, I think that's clear. I think that would be what's required. My concern would be about how that legislation is then implemented, and any sort of potential gaps that we might expose ourselves to. Because at the end of the day, you can agree a policy, you can pass legislation, but the implementation of that and all the systems required, recent history would tell us that that remains a risk. I'm not saying it's a probability, but it's a risk, and I think that's something that we need to be cautious about. Could I come back to the point about simplification and improvement, which was the latter question? I sat for my sins on the Simplification Task Force, Scottish Government Simplification Task Force. I think this bill, giving Scottish ministers powers to start to tweak some of the CAP legislation from 2021, can be used to everybody's advantage, both governments, agents of governments, and indeed farmers and crofters benefit in terms of simplification around things like mapping, penalties, inspection processes, and things like that. I think where you then talk about moving from simplification to improvement is a slightly grey area, because I would agree that interpretation of improvement is open to, well, that's when you're starting to look at policy rather than operation. Simplification is all about operations of existing schemes. That's what we're talking about in terms of simplification. You're looking at the current CAP rules and how they can be made to work better in Scotland through this bill. You're not necessarily looking at how you change policy to deliver different things using taxpayers' funding to achieve different outcomes. So I think there is a difference between simplification and improvement.
I know you want to come in, Eleanor. I'm just going to bring Jamie in to see if I can tie it together, and then I'll come back to you, Eleanor, and then back to Mike.
Thank you, Convener. That's kind of you. And good morning to the panel. It's a very quick question following on from Mr Hall's point of view. At the moment, the Section 2, power to simplify or improve CAP legislation, it's a very short section, 3 simple sentences. The second one says that ministers can make modifications that they consider would simplify or improve the operation of the provisions of the legislation. I wonder if at some point you will be coming forward with alternative wording if you think this is inappropriate. And indeed, the third section says regulations under this section are subject to the negative procedure. If you think that provides enough parliamentary scrutiny to such changes.
That's an important point, and in our written submission we do raise the issue around the difference between negative and affirmative resolution, because I think when you're talking about ministerial powers, it's about how those are exercised in many senses. Issues around simplification, I think significant number of the potential simplifications we're talking around mapping rules, inspections and penalties, because that's basically what we're talking about in the short term, probably do require a wider degree of consultation before decisions are made, rather than being made unilaterally by ministers, and then a degree of scrutiny by the likes of this committee to ensure that they are going to deliver the objectives of improving back to the improvement word, improving the situation for farmers and crofters as the claimants and the recipients under the schemes that we currently have. So I do have concerns about the whole procedural side of what the bill is inferring.
You want to come in?
It's been pretty well covered by Johnny and Jamie's question. I was just going to make the point that I do wonder if, in terms of scrutiny for things like improvements and even some of the simplifications, as to whether a negative procedure was sufficient. But it's been well covered.
Come on to that in a minute, I think. Mike, you...
One final point. My concern, but to go on the regulation rather than primary legislation, isn't about parliamentary scrutiny. We can have as much parliamentary scrutiny over primary legislation as you can with regulations. The issue with regulations is the minister of the day decides what system it's going to be, what the rules are going to be. It brings the regulations to Parliament, and we can only say yes or no. And the pressure to say yes is incredible. So if you want a really good scrutiny of...
Yeah, sorry, Stuart.
Sorry.
He's not...
Sorry, I was following on from Jamie.
Yeah, well, do you want to follow it up, Stuart, with your question? Because I know you were concerned just about the level of scrutiny. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, colleagues are beginning to make the point, and I think we've got a shared view. I've heard Eleanor say that negative doesn't permit scrutiny. I've heard Christopher say it doesn't permit scrutiny, and the NFUS, in its submission at paragraphs 14 and 15, say does not allow scope for parliamentary scrutiny in 14, etc., and the same in 15. I invite colleagues on the panel to look at today's agenda. The second item on the agenda is scrutiny of a negative instrument. I just wonder where this is coming from, that there's no scrutiny. And indeed, I've just heard Johnny say that ministers can unilaterally change the law. And I just don't know where that's coming from. And I'm sure it's coming from somewhere, and I'd quite like to hear where it's coming from, because there is no secondary legislation in this policy area that will not come for scrutiny to this committee. And I just wonder where colleagues at the other end of the table are getting this from.
Eleanor, do you want to come in on that?
I think it's more, it's Mike's point, that it's a yes or a no. And yes, you can debate it and point out where you disagree, but ultimately it's a yes or a no. The lack of scrutiny is where we can get involved and say what we think needs to be happening, whereas it's much harder within a negative procedure.
Why?
It just seems to be much harder for us to really
scrutinise. Well, it shouldn't be. There's consultations on secondary legislation that changes policy, just as there is on primary. I'm genuinely, you know, if people are saying that from that end of the table, there is a problem. I'm trying to just understand what it is. Is that because the way in which the government is interacting with stakeholders in making secondary legislation is not fit for purpose?
Because I think on where negative instruments come forward is the government are supposed to be consulting before the instrument comes to the committee, and the industry then can feed into the government as part of that process. And then it is up to members, as I understand it, to put a motion forward to if they're not happy with it. So I think the point that Stuart's making is by inference, you are suggesting that the government is not consulting sufficiently prior to the instrument. Is that right, Stuart?
That is, it's a bit more broadly drawn, but that's essentially the point. I will make the point there is no legal requirement to consult even on primary legislation, and where there's no policy change, and indeed the instrument we're going to look at has not been consulted on because there's no policy change.
And in fairness, it would be up to those people when they're answering to say that they would be more happy with the other system.
I really, what I'm trying to
Johnny,
tease
do you want
out,
to come on that?
but sorry, just to be clear, what I'm pursuing is, if I'm hearing that, what I think I'm actually hearing is that the present system in relation to creating secondary legislation is not providing adequate opportunity for stakeholders to come in. And I just want to get a bit more about what makes you feel that, so that we can say to the government, here's something you need to do. I don't think it's about scrutiny as such. So,
area between, it's that grey area, I suspect, which takes us back to Mike Rumble's point about your definition of what would be a simplification in everybody's interests, and an assumption that of what that might be, and an improvement. Now, clearly, Scottish Government, and I think quite rightly, are looking to move from simplification to improvement. That's the language they're using all the time around this. But it's improvement in what sense? And therefore, I think as stakeholders, we want to be absolutely involved in that process from the outset. You know, what instigates that? Is it an improvement that is to the benefit of administrators, or is it an improvement of farmers and crofters, or both, ideally? And it's that process we want to be involved with.
So the process that is concerning you is the consultation process.
Yes.
Because of the scrutiny process, I think we can later ask all legislation, negative, positive,
and that's the function of this building, this institution.
Yeah, sure. Right, that's fine. I think we've.
Mike, do you want to come back on that?
To add that, I will try and give way to Stuart quite rightly, because it was his question, but the important thing is we're not worried about there not being enough scrutiny. We can, if this committee decides to scrutinise legislation, whether it's or regulations, we can do it. It's not a problem. What we cannot do, and this is fundamental, goes back to my question, is that we can only change what the government wants to do if it's primary legislation. And you must see hundreds of regulations that go through basically on the nod, even if we scrutinise them, because nobody wants to stop something happening, because there's a tremendous pressure for change, and if the government says this needs to be done, then we tend to support that. So the issue for me, and for some members of the committee I'm sure, is Section 3 about going down the regulation route for change rather than primary legislation. I'll go back to the point I was making right at the beginning, and I'm glad to hear that I think that if you just confirm this, that you are supportive of putting some sort of date in there for primary legislation to be brought forward. Otherwise, if it's not there, this bill will allow whatever government of the future to continue for as many years as it wants to, going down the regulation route rather than primary legislation.
So I noticed a few nods of the head. Does anyone disagree? Just say so it's clear, because a nod of the head can't be recorded on the record.
Mike Rumble's last point, absolutely.
Does anyone else want to say yay or no to it?
No, I agree with it.
Alan?
Yeah, I agree. For future policy, after the transition period, you need primary legislation.
Okay. Okay. Colin, you wanted to come in, and then I'll come back to Stuart. Colin.
I just wanted to ask the panel, though, that there is no disagreement that the improvements need to start to happen between now and the next legislation 2024 coming through. We can't simply wait until then. Those improvements need to happen. It's simply a case of the process for making sure there's proper consultation on those improvements, but everybody's agreement that those improvements actually need to start happening now. We can't simply say this is about purely stability and then we'll have a new policy in 2024.
Hold on, Johnny, hold on. Yvonne, you wanted to come in and indicate it first.
I think we actually, from that echo there, that we all agree that it needs to, that any change, the improvements would need to be agreed, and that can be quite a long process, and correct, efficient implementation of the change as well. And I note that any changes with regards to our improvements, which aren't defined, I think, under this bill, and that makes people a bit nervous, but that they do need to be subject to parliamentary legislation. So that is, from my experience, as can be an awful long time, even for small things. So,
I'm disagreeing with Yvonne because you all seem to sort of say yes at the same time. If we're all disagreeing, we've got to might move on to the next part of Stuart's question. So
Yes.
no one's disagreeing. Good,
And it's a different subject, so we'll just move on. It's really about where we go in future, because clearly we've got the issue of we're policy aligned within a single framework with the EU at the moment. To what extent should we retain that once we're outside the EU? And there might be reasons we're doing that. But also, of course, we don't yet know about the overarching framework for the UK and the different administrations of the UK. And to what extent does this bill enable or inhibit areas where implementations may be different in different jurisdictions? What are people thinking in relation to this bill, because that's our sole concern today, enabling or inhibiting proper differences, but also enabling a common framework which we're going to have to work in?
Johnny.
I think it's an incredibly important question that's been raised. Fundamentally, agricultural policy is devolved. As you know, we currently have 4 different settlements of the CAP across the 4 different devolved administrations of the UK. And that's quite rightly so, because it reflects the different agricultural profiles and the different needs of those devolved nations. But we also operate within an internal UK market and currently within an internal EU market. And therefore, when it comes to the actual standards which underpin agricultural practice, then they are common and set across there. So it's that grey area between the delivery of agricultural policy and the means and tools, how farmers and crofters are incentivised to do certain things for certain outcomes we want to achieve on the one hand, versus maintaining a standard of operation, if you like, the rule book, if you like, on the other hand, in order to prevent any sort of destabilising of an internal market. And that going forward is going to be very, very important indeed. With the UK leaving the EU, it is absolutely imperative in our view that we have commonly agreed, and the agreed bit being really important, regulatory frameworks around agricultural operations, if you like, all things around pesticide use, environmental standards, animal health and welfare issues and all the rest of it. They must be done on a UK-wide basis, but thereafter it's about how different devolved administrations implement measures to support or incentivise farmers and crofters to do different things in different places. Clearly, we've seen a very different trajectory from DEFRA with regards to England. We also know the Welsh Assembly Government and Northern Irish are doing very different things. Scotland must have an ability to develop and implement its own agricultural policy, but we would see that being absolutely necessarily done on a common framework. So bringing it back to the bill and the question about this bill, it is questionable whether this bill does not potentially undermine some of that by giving certain powers to ministers to set different rules around things like carcass classification, marketing standards and other things. It's almost the polar opposite of the concerns we had around the UK Agriculture Bill, which was introduced to Westminster in September 2018, whereby you have some sort of potential to operate in a different fashion. I'm not saying it would be used, but in a different fashion within Scotland as opposed to the rest of the UK. Now, I think that's already been raised by other committees within this Parliament.
Can I just tease out? We'll come back to carcasses. The convener is going to quiz you on that one. But just standards, you mostly referred to standards there as standards of how you do things. So the one I wrote down before you gave your list was slurry, for example, where there are standards and various things. But of course, there are also standards about the outcomes that you deliver, the standards that need to be met on the products you produce and so on and so forth. So I take it when you referred to standards, you were actually talking about both kinds of standards.
Yeah, standards both in terms of the actual agricultural activity, the production methods, but equally in terms of the standards attached to the products that are then sold into the market.
But you, in terms of policy and practice, you're looking to have differences that reflect the different geography and different agricultural products that are produced in the different jurisdictions. We must retain that flexibility.
In terms of delivering schemes that enable farmers and crofters to do things differently in Scotland, not in terms of the practice, the rules of which by they operate, but how they're supported should be devolved, absolutely, as it currently is.
Okay.
Ellen, do you want to come in on that, or are you?
No, it's okay.
Okay, I think we've covered it.
I think
Sorry,
it's
Yvonne.
really important that as to echo Johnny, it's so important that agricultural in Scotland continues to be devolved.
Okay. Christopher, and then I'm going to bring in the deputy.
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate that Scotland is always going to be better off with its own unique policy, but within Scotland there are very different regions with different requirements, and we need to keep that flexibility going forward, that Scotland is not a one-size-fits-all for agricultural policy.
Okay. The deputy convener, Maureen, wants to come in. Maureen.
Yeah, thank you, convener. Morning, panel. Johnny, just to pick up your point about standards and the importance of them being UK-wide, supposing Scotland relies on selling its quality product because of high standards. So if one of the four nations decided that standards should be lowered for whatever reason, pleasing the Americans or whatever, you're not saying that we should go along that route, are you?
Absolutely not. And we're into the whole argument that we've been pursuing for the last 3 years about any agricultural framework within the UK post-departure from the EU has to be commonly agreed, and the governance of those standards cannot rest with the Secretary of State for DEFRA. And that's what we've said time and time again. And we've also said time and time again that when it comes to standards, anything in terms of imports, if we're looking at new trading arrangements with which I think you're inferring with non-EU countries, anything that's currently illegal to produce here shouldn't be allowed to come into this country. We need to maintain our standards at the threshold there are now, if not improve them, because that is what sells our product.
Lizzie, you were nodding there. Do you want to add to that?
It's more just from the ground. I work pretty much on the ground. I'm a farm secretary and also work at home in the farm. So from that perspective as well, what Johnny's saying, you know, fundamentally that we require the same standards to be met or across the board. But if the standards were to be lowered in any of the other countries, then we would still want to have that high standard, you know, through like the Scotch beef label, Scotch lamb, Scotch pork. You know, we do have the label and the standards attached to that. Farmers understand that those standards, they've been working with them for so long. So if anything, for continuity, coming from working on the ground, I would say to keep things simplistic and keep some, you know, and have the continuity running through for going forward certainly is the best option.
Right. Stuart, you want to come briefly back in?
So, one final point which could take another 2 hours, but I think a one-sentence answer is probably desired. And the NFUS contribution that you've submitted doesn't answer this question. To what extent do we need to remain aligned with EU rules? Because, of course, if we're exporting to the EU, we're going to have to conform to their rules. And to what extent will it be useful to retain alignment, or have we identified areas where it would be useful to diverge? And back to, we're dealing with this bill, to what extent does the bill inhibit or aid our doing that?
Yvonne, you wanted to come in, and I'll then come to you, John.
One word reply, totally.
Okay.
3-word reply, totally and utterly.
Johnny.
I'll use slightly more than 3 words. But in the same sense, the question was raised directly with NFU Scotland. Again, as we've said throughout the piece, if we wish to retain our trading arrangements under whatever might follow in terms of some sort of trading agreement with the EU, then I think almost certainly we will have to operate at the same standard or equivalent standard which is agreed by both parties. And I think that's absolutely necessary, and would echo what Yvonne's just said. We mustn't erode that at all.
And sorry, just before we move on, I'm just going to ask a question, and this can be a very simple answer. I've yet to meet ever a farmer that wants to reduce the high standards of production that we have. I certainly haven't met them around Scotland when I've been going around. I assume that is the general feeling of the panel, that we've got very good standards and it's imperative that we keep them. We're all nodding. Johnny?
I would put one rider on it. Nobody wants to erode the standards, but there is, and it comes back to the bill, there is scope to how we manage those standards in terms of the inspection process and the proportionality of penalties around that, and the mapping issues that we do have concerns with. So the standard itself, absolutely no problem. How that's enforced and regulated, I think, is another matter entirely, and I think that's where this bill could add real value.
Okay. The next question comes from Richard Lau. Richard.
Good morning, panel. There have been a number of quotes from people regarding the rural policy development, and NFU actually made an interesting quote. NFU Scotland considers that the Scottish Government ambitions do not go far enough. Stability and simplicity in the here and now are important, but it is vital that the opportunity is grasped to take Scottish agricultural beyond transition and into a new Scottish agricultural policy that is bold and carries a clear intent of providing financial support as the emphasis shifts to supporting those driving productivity gains and delivering desired environmental outcomes. So, does the panel think that this bill is bold and provides clarity regarding the priorities and objectives for rural policy in Scotland during the transition period from now until 2024?
Eleanor, do you want to head off on that?
I know you started with an NFU's quote, but I think actually as stakeholders we're all quite aligned in our thinking that we need to be more ambitious, we need to move. This bill is very much designed to keep things the same and tide us over for the transition. It doesn't set out the plans for the future. It's not intended to do that because we haven't had any put to us yet as to where we're moving to and to what needs to change in the transition period. We've set it out in our Route 2050. There's NFUS's steps to change. As a sector, we've been quite clear in the fact that we know we need to change and we think we know what we need. But this bill doesn't deliver that, and it's not intended to, I don't think.
Johnny?
This bill in itself does not go anywhere near far enough, but this bill in itself is a necessary stepping stone, as I said earlier on, to that situation. I still believe that the here and now of things like Brexit challenges will be small beer compared to the other challenges facing the industry over the next decade. 2030, this Parliament has set 75% reduction in emissions targets. Agriculture will have to play a huge role in delivering that, but it cannot do so with the current tools in the toolbox, and therefore we need a new agricultural policy beyond this continuity bill, if you like, that will enable farmers and crofters to do far more of that. So I would absolutely rigidly agree with the quote you've just said, NFU Scotland.
I don't want to say into other people's questions, but the one thing I'd like to see is basically everybody in Scotland, the industry, the government, any organisation, sitting down and agreeing what is required as we move after Brexit. That's my view. But I'll move on to my second question.
Just for your second question, Christopher, I think wanted to come in briefly on your...
No, just to reiterate what others have said, the bill, to my mind, is for one purpose only, which is the transition period. We do need to look at policy going forward, and there are huge challenges facing agriculture over the next decade, and the sooner we come up with policies, joined up thinking, not just for agriculture, but for rural as a whole, and that's missing at the moment.
again, there's going to be major changes, and I think that everybody has to sit down after, after the bill comes in after Brexit and basically agree, because there will be winners and there will be losers. And I don't think it's fair that it's continually the government's blamed, because you have the opportunity, I believe, to sit down and agree a policy before we implement it. In my next question, how would you expect rural policy in Scotland to change during the transition period? What are your priorities for the transition period, and what would you prefer to be included in that transition?
That is a massive question, so and it could allow you all to go off on massive answers.
Just so, one item for each, then.
So everyone will get a chance. Why don't we start at Yvonne, work that way, and come back to you, Christopher, at the end.
Environment, retaining population, the accessibility for public. The production of high-quality vegetable, grains, meat, that I'll pass it on to someone else. There's lots of things, but all under that, and that all agriculture, a good fit-for-purpose agricultural policy can help underpin all that, encourage it and make it flourish. If you get the right people round and that you've got a will and pragmatism, that we do have an opportunity, though there are a lot of threats.
Lizzie.
Pretty much just exactly what Yvonne said. The data collection that we currently have, for me, lets you see exactly what happens in Scotland. And across the UK, obviously, as well. But within what we currently do, sort of paperwork-wise, does give you a good indication. So I'm pretty much reiterating exactly what Yvonne said. And I'll move on to Johnny.
The current CAP under which we operate is fundamentally flawed. Why? Because 90% of all the support payments going to farmers and crofters are based on declaring an area of land and have no reflection on how that land is managed. Therefore, we need to move swiftly to an action-based approach, actions around improving productivity and delivering on the environment. And we've got those in our Steps to Change document. And fundamentally, that's the biggest change we can make, breaking the link from area-based payments to action-based payments to see real outcomes to achieve fundamental objectives around climate change, productivity, food production, rural communities, population, and so on.
Can I say I totally agree with your statement? I don't want to veer into anyone else's question, but that's refreshing. Yes, I agree with you.
I would like to hear what Eleanor and Christopher have got to say as well, though.
I could be a bit lazy and just refer you to our Route 2050, but in it we've set out that we want to see within the transition that embracing of the integrated land management approach that looks at business efficiency and improving resilience so that we can make the most of the opportunities that are to come, but also weather the storms that are inevitable and enable us to focus on our environmental credentials, which are fantastic, but we can build on that, including the climate change targets that we've set ourselves.
The current support framework, which is based on area payments, is not helpful for the tenanted sector. At the moment, you can a landowner can access area payments with very little activity. So we would like to see a change to focus on activity rather than area payments. At the moment, the tenanted sector is hamstrung really with a taxation framework that works against the tenanted sector. Now, there's nothing we can do about that here because it's not a devolved taxation is not a devolved issue. But the support framework should be changed to move away from area-based payments to activity, and I think that would help the tenanted sector.
Thank you.
Richard, is that you finished on that line? Yeah. I mean, just to comment, I found it quite interesting. No one used the word that used the two words that used to be bandied around quite a lot was food security, high quality food production. But is there a need to ensure that there's sufficient food produced in Scotland for those that want to eat it? I mean, is that part of that? Ellen, did you want to come?
There's absolutely need, but I don't think environmental and food production are at contracts with each other. I think if you're producing food sustainably and efficiently and it's high quality, I think it goes hand in hand with good environmental practice. They are not at odds with each other.
Does anyone else want to come back? John?
In an increasingly unstable world, food security has got to be an issue for any government. Food price inflation is the last thing a government really wants to see anywhere. But we do live in a trading world. I think what we need to do will never be self-sufficient in Scotland or indeed the UK. So let's drop any notion of that. But what we need to do is focus on what we do and do it very well, do it in the most effective manner. And utilise that not only in terms of providing food, but equally in driving the rural economy and indeed a major sector of the Scottish economy in terms of the food and drink sector.
Okay. Jamie, you've got the next question, Jamie.
Thank you. I had my first bag of crickets the other day in my effort to expand my protein sources, so I think you're absolutely right. The way in which we consume is changing by the day. I just want to bring it back to what this bill does and doesn't do, and how we move forward from this, because I'm getting the impression, we've had a few evidence sessions on this, and I was quite struck by a quote that we had from Professor Michael Keating from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, who said that the bill is a symptom of the tendency to fix little bits and pieces rather than bringing together the big picture to see how environment, agriculture and rural development fit together. There have been calls from other witnesses that they would have preferred to have seen a hybrid bill that allows and caters for the transition and gives governments the government the ability to manage that, but also points in the general direction of what should happen next. So it's somewhere between a full new piece of legislation for rural policy and what we've got here, which is a fairly simple transition bill, or something in the middle. Would you like to see this bill used to become more of a hybrid? Would you prefer a new bill, or would you prefer a more sweeping, comprehensive piece of legislation?
Eleanor, do you want to head off on that?
It's a really good question. It's clearly a bridging bill. It's not doing anything sort of beyond that. But whilst the UK Ag Bill isn't perfect, what it did set out was that direction for England, and Wales sort of quickly followed suit. And it's meant that they have started their piloting, they have started looking at the new environmental land management system that they're going to be using, and that is the key thing that we are missing. I'm not sure whether this bill needs to be sort of amended to reflect that, or whether it needs to be quickly followed by an additional piece of legislation.
Right.
But it would be fantastic to get that direction quite, very quickly.
So just before others come in, one witness from Nourish Scotland said the bill should have a purposes clause that lists the purposes for which ministers may make grants, for example. Others have called for additional wording to have a purpose of the future direction of policy, so maybe that's something you can reflect on in your answers.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. It's definitely something that would help sort of probably settle some of our concerns as to what changes could be made if it was a sort of encouragement to follow more environmental or climate change focused agenda. That is that sort of thing that we're lacking, is that intention as to what changes would be made.
Johnny, you want to come in?
The real answer is that we are where we are. In an ideal world, we would have had something far more progressive, but we do need this bill to act in the short to medium term, given that it now looks almost certain that we will absolutely leave the EU by the end of 2020. And to provide that continuity, we need this legislation. I think the problem that we have in Scotland, and it's a shared problem, it's not government's, not ours, we all have a responsibility here, is that we all talk around change, and there's been lots of talk around change from everywhere, but we haven't agreed on where change should take us yet. And if you can't agree on what the landing space should be for agriculture in Scotland and what its roles and responsibilities and purpose should be, then you can't agree on how you get there. So you can't fundamentally put in this bill that we're going to have schemes to do X, Y, and Z without knowing where you actually want to get to. That's the problem. And obviously this committee has a clear interest in the new farming and food policy, future farming and food policy group that has been recently established. I know there's a serious interest within some of the members in how that deliberates. But what we really need is that group and other governmental processes to come out as soon as possible with a clear statement about where do we want to get to and when, and then we can decide how we get there.
Christopher, do you want to come in? I mean, sorry, I'm just going to say, if you want to come in, just try and catch my eye, because I'm sort of fishing around to see whether you want to come in, and I don't want to embarrass you if you don't want to come in. So give me a wave. Yvonne, you're very good at giving me a wave when you want to come in, and I'll bring you in if I can. Christopher, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Johnny. We are where we are. We've got this bill to cover the short-term period, which is very necessary. But for policy going forward, I imagine that we need another bill. And my feeling is that we shouldn't focus just on agricultural policy. It should be more joined up with other rural policy. You mentioned food security. Well, obviously food security has competing interests with forestry, energy, biomass, anaerobic digestion, etc. At the moment, we see some of those interests competing against each other, and there are winners and losers. But as far as I can see, in the past, we've looked at these different rural issues in their own silos and not looked at them all together. And I think a future rural policy needs to look at the bigger picture of how all those interests compete against each other. Jamie, do you want to?
Yeah, and so, I mean, on that then, because obviously we're scrutinising this piece of legislation, and after we've summed up evidence, we'll report back to the government what we think should happen next as a committee. But should this, therefore, this particular bill have a very specific purpose that only covers transition, have an end date, and mandate the government to come forward with a new piece of legislation that does some of the things that you're talking about? And if so, when should that new piece of legislation be brought forward within the transition period?
Johnny, and then Christopher.
Is that essentially the same question that Mike Rumbles? And,
yes,
I think that certainly, from my point of view, our point of view, absolutely. We could probably discuss in some detail about actual timings, but I think there should be some sort of mandate on government to deliver the next phase of this process.
Christopher.
I think work on coming up with new policy needs to start now. My understanding is that it has started with the Future Policy Group. In terms of timing, I imagine that's dependent on how Brexit works out, the trade, what arrangements we end up with trading partners. But the bigger picture thinking and the broader thinking, I think, needs to start now for new policy. And we can't expect this bill to do it. This bill's just to cover a gap.
Emma, you wanted to come in with us.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. In page 1 of the policy memorandum, it states that the purpose of this bill is intended to provide the Scottish Ministers with regulation-making powers to amend or replace EU Common Agricultural Policy. And bullet point 2 talks about enabling pilot projects to be run in order to test out new policy approaches so as to inform the development of longer-term future rural policy. So isn't that enabling wording that allows tests or pilot tests of changes to be implemented and get on with pretty quickly? Because in last week's evidence, we heard about environment, biodiversity, a wider land use strategy. So this bullet point would enable pilot projects that could be delivered under a wider land use strategy that would support, testing and getting on with the job faster.
Do you want to kick off with that?
I absolutely agree. There's nothing in this that would stop pilots being undertaken. And that's exactly what we needed. But what we don't have is any sort of steer on what those pilots would be for. And I know it's work that's been included in the Food and Farming Futures Group. I think that's the right one. And that is something that they're looking at. But the timescale in which we're getting this information is it's certainly not as quick as we'd like it to be. We've had the Ag Chance report, we've had the National Council of Rural Advisors, we've had various inquiries done into this that have highlighted where we think we need to be going. But we have sort of another task force and another review, but we surely know enough to start putting out ideas to stakeholders to be consulted on as to what pilots could be done and how we could tender for them. It was remarkable how quickly it happened. It's happened in Wales and in England, how quickly they've got their pilots underway. So it can be turned around very, very swiftly, but whilst the bill allows for piloting, it doesn't give us any idea as to what they would be for.
Okay, yep, Yvonne, sorry.
There are some pilots going on just now that I think they're funded by, all right, they're funded by SNH, and they're in 4 different areas of Scotland. One's Skye, one's Argyll, one's
East Lothian, and one's Strathspey.
And they're looking at replacement cap, if you like, and cap's very prescriptive, so that they're looking at a more pragmatic system, and it's actually very good, so that there is little things happening, but I don't know, maybe it's obviously not widely promoted, and I think there might be concerns as well over the funding of these, and they're based on quite a lot of the projects that have happened in the Burren area in Ireland, which have been remarkably successful in terms of generating more hen harriers, better results with cattle, much more based on traditional methods, but not old-fashioned, if you like, but just ticking a lot of boxes. And that's it.
And Johnny, on this.
Just first of all, just to follow up on Yvonne's, the pilot projects that SNH are running are all about this sort of bottom-up approach, but it only really looks at agri-environment measures and what we might replace our current agri-environment climate scheme with. And it doesn't look at things like productivity, it doesn't look at the performance of the agricultural business or anything like that. To really address Emma Harper's point is that pilots are great. Pilots will tell you lots of things. But if you're then only going to roll those out on a wider scale that has significant outcomes that you want from 2024 onwards, I would say that's too little too late. What we really need to do is put in place a whole suite of measures that every farmer and crofter can do now. The expediency of 2030, I can't emphasise it enough. If every farm and croft in Scotland did soil testing, did a carbon audit, and was member of a benchmarking group, they would tick 3 very important boxes around input efficiency, climate change, and financial performance. Now, it doesn't take that much to put that in place, other than probably financial resources, more than anything else. And that would fundamentally change the performance of Scottish agriculture, both in terms of how they operate as businesses and in terms of what they're delivering in terms of climate change and other things, bearing in mind that those things are not mutually exclusive. We drive efficiencies at a business level. Nutrient management and soil testing and carbon audits are all pretty much one and the same. And that would therefore, I think, make those businesses more resilient, more market-focused, but at the same time, delivering on a wider public agenda. I just don't understand why we're not getting on with that sooner rather than later.
And you've made that point very clearly, Johnny. I'm going to go to the next question, which is from Angus. Angus.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to the panel. If I could turn to discussing ELFAS and ANC issues. There's clearly a majority of opinion amongst stakeholders that the ELFAS-style lifeline support for farmers and crofters must continue. In fact, the 2016 independent evaluation concluded that many LFA farm enterprises would not be sustainable in the absence of support payments. So the Bill team have suggested that they may wish to make changes to the ELFAS scheme, and indicated previously in this committee that they're still working on the new areas of natural constraint approach. So do you feel that this change is appropriate, or were you expecting any other changes to less favoured area support as a result of the bill?
There's a whole lot of people leaning forward at that stage. I'll start with Johnny, and Yvonne, I suspect you may have some comments on it, and Christopher as well.
The current LFA support scheme is vitally important to farmers and crofters in Scotland. It is fundamentally business defining in some situations. However, along with the basic payment scheme, it's an area-based payment. It's blunt. It doesn't necessarily deliver on its objectives of retaining grazing management in our hills and uplands, retaining populations, avoiding agricultural land abandonment and all the rest of it. So we do need to move away from the current LFA support scheme, but we need to find something that can replace it, that delivers on the requirements of our less favoured areas. That's going to be easier said than done. The reason why the Scottish Government is citing it is because we already know that we have a challenge with the existing European regulations, which are actually forcing us down the so-called parachute payments route, whereby payments under LFAS are being reduced this year, 2019, and then will be reduced significantly again in 2020. So there's a sort of a real urgency about how we look at LFAS and the reform of LFAS, in fact replacing it with something completely new. But I go back to the point I made to Richard Lyle earlier on, is that we need to use that as an opportunity to move away from a blunt area-based payment where you could throw as much money as you like at it, but it won't necessarily change what's happening on the ground, to something that actually supports activity, particularly through grazing, livestock grazing management, and all the associated benefits of that in terms of social, economic and environmental.
Yvonne.
LFAS, I broadly agree with Johnny that LFAS is, or some support is vital to keep rural communities in the Highlands and the islands there. That if we didn't have LFAS support, it would in danger of collapsing. It would change the landscape quite considerably, and I mean that both in terms of the look of it as well as population. That it can be improved. It can be much better tailored. It can be less prescriptive. We need less prescriptive parts of the schemes to better support and better support the areas that really are less favoured. I understand that about 70% of Scotland land is considered less favoured?
85%.
85%. So you've got nearly the whole of Scotland is 85% less favoured. But within that, you have got huge differences. You might have good farmland in Nairn, Inverness-shire, and you've got bog unused. So it doesn't fit. It just, so you're not so the public money isn't, there's not value from the public money because it's a blanket approach. And that is where we've got the opportunity to change it, to support productivity, but to balance that as well with environmental concerns. It's either one thing or the other, and that's not worked. We need a balance.
I think just to clarify, the question was whether you expect changes as a result of this bill. So, Christopher, you probably got comments on it, and I just wondered if you could answer that second part of the question.
Do we expect changes with LFAS?
Yes.
Yes, and we would hope for a replacement for LFAS going forward. It's vital for the disadvantaged areas of Scotland, and we would look for a strong link with activity. But LFAS, as it is a broad brush, but there are certain areas that need more specific help.
Angus,
Yeah, well, just if I could finish with maybe a daft laddie question. Is there an argument to return to support on a headage basis on a regional area?
Lizzie, you're going to come in, and then I'll come to you, Johnny.
I was actually going to reply with to do a stock and density or headage basis. Okay. Was what I was going to suggest actually, just purely because then that's on actual activity. So that goes back to what Johnny was intimating, that it's on the activity basis. And that would certainly help, because we have that 85% of Scotland in LFA ground. You know, that is obviously the vast majority of Scotland at the end of the day, and we need to help that sector, and to do it on a headage basis or stocking density, certainly. Payment rate would be the best option.
So, Johnny, in answering that question, could you just, is there implications for WTO rules if it's done on a headage basis?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't agree with we should be doing it on a headage basis, but I don't agree we should be doing it on an area basis, I've just said. What we actually need is a hybrid between the two, and Lizzie's just touched on that, about stocking density, rather than a payment per skull, if you like, which is what we used to have prior to 2005, the old direct support payments, and prior to 2001. HLCAs, Hill Livestock Compensatory Amounts, was what preceded LFAS, and again, that was a payment on suckler cows and breeding ewes. So we ended up with a very inefficient agricultural system where we just kept livestock. Not how we actually manage that livestock, so we don't want to go back to that. In terms of the WTO question, I think there's more than enough scope within the UK's headroom on WTO for this to not be an issue. If we started to pay on headage payment again, just as we currently do under the ewe-hog scheme and the calf scheme in Pillar 1, we're not going to start to distort trade on a global scale by any stretch of the imagination. Our Steps to Change document, our proposals in that are absolutely a hybrid of stocking density, i.e. livestock, and area. Those two things come together to be a measure of activity. It's not one or the other, but it's somewhere in the middle.
Yvonne, bring you in briefly, and then I'm going to move to the next question.
This is where a prescribed approach doesn't work, because as I think that we've all pointed out, that it's probably the solution is a mixture of everything. With stocking density, that if you've got common grazings and that you're running a hill flock of sheep on common grazings that is poor land, it's in Region 3, that you're getting like £5 subsidy per hectare, that there's 1,000 on our sheep stock club, there's over 1,000 ewes, that we're losing 200 up to 300 lambs a year to predation. It could be foxes or seagulls. So really, if you didn't, and we are getting into trouble because we can't maintain on the hill, on the Trottenish Ridge, the amount of sheep that the department is saying that we should have. But no matter what we're doing, and that the money and all the money in the subsidies that goes out to local labour to support the rural, to the rural area, which is all sort of termed as very low economic, almost deprivation, rural deprivation. So this is where the subsidies just doesn't go into the pocket of the hill farmers or crofters. It gets spread out.
I'm just thinking that we're almost getting into the process of redesigning the LFAS scheme, which I think I'm going to be very mean and drag us back to the bill and move to the next question, if I may, which comes from Colin Smith. Colin.
Thanks, Convener. Can I move to some of the financial aspects in the bill? Obviously, the bill gives ministers powers to modify the financial provisions in CAP legislation, so that could mean moving money between pillars, between different schemes. It also suggests a cap on individual payments. Can I ask the panel for your views on these powers and how they should be used?
Johnny, you want to go off on that?
Well, the first one about the Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 transfer is already in existence under the EU legislation, and currently that's at 9.5% Pillar 1 to Pillar 2 transfer in Scotland. That was a decision taken back by Richard Lockhead in 2013-14. I think it's absolutely right that we retain that power, but where that power might be adjusted is the fact that under EU law it can only go up from 9.5% up to the maximum of 15%. There is an argument having the flexibility to go down if required as well. Because obviously future funding remains a relative unknown once we're out with the CAP. So having the flexibility to move from Pillar 1 to Pillar 2, I think is an important thing to retain, but you want maximum flexibility there so you could move money back from Pillar 2 to Pillar 1 if need be. That said, in the longer term, I think we need to get rid of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, fundamentally. And that's a European construct. That what we're talking about in our approach to future policy, we don't have to have Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. We have to underpin agricultural businesses and so on. Can I go to the capping point? Capping already exists, again, but it's set at such a high threshold of €600,000, and it's only based on basic payment. It's touching nobody. I think having a power to cap payments to individual recipients is probably important. The question is a policy one on how that would be used. And beyond that, how would the yield of any cap be recycled and reused to underpin other actions that are required?
Anyone else want to come in on capping and things? Yeah. Yvonne.
I agree with capping, but it needs to be done looking very carefully and thoroughly at the details so that you're not actually you end up being quite, you do something that you've set out that you don't want to do. So, but especially when it needs to be scrutinised, it's public money.
So, Christopher, capping an activity?
Yeah, we would be supportive of capping, and the question of what to do with the surplus that might, or the excess from the capping, it may be an opportunity to create a fund that helps genuine new entrants into farming, because they are disadvantaged. They're competing with established businesses to get in.
Eleanor.
The capping is quite an interesting one, and it's whether it's capping on a claimant level or a holding level. Is it capping Pillar 1 or Pillar 2? The need for capping and the role of what you do with that sort of revenue is quite a valuable one to know whether it would be looking at climate change or environment or what would happen with that revenue if it's for the pilots. But I think you need to sort of take a step back to sort of look at the purpose of the capping and what it's supposed to do and what it's targeted at, because if it's Pillar 2 money that you end up capping, because this is open-ended capping and setting of ceilings, which you can set ceilings already, but to get down to a sort of individual holding level, it's important that we don't have any unintended consequences that prevent or put land managers off doing good things.
I'm going to bring Peter in and then Johnny, I'll come to you. Yeah.
The moment when it's a very high level, and any farmer I speak to, they're all in favour of capping, basically, as long as the cap is just above what they receive. And that is the issue. You know, it's very easy to say, you know, my payment's £30,000, therefore cap at 35 would work. But that's the reality is, if we go down this road, we've got to get some idea as to where it looks to be a fair level. I don't expect anybody to come up with a fair level, but I make the point that is the problem, that it will hurt businesses, and it often will hurt the big business, and it's often the big business that actually delivers a lot for the environmental issues. Big business can often be very good at delivering on environmental issues, and these are the very businesses that you're going to hurt with the cap.
Come on.
It follows up on Peter Chapman's comments that, first of all, there's more than one way to skin a rabbit when it comes to capping. You can just obviously set a single absolute limit, or you can actually apply digressive payments, whereby you start to scale back. And I would draw the committee's attention to what's happening in Europe right now in terms of the proposals for the next CAP. The proposal on the table from the European Commission is that businesses would start to have their payments reduced above €60,000 and then receive nothing over and above €100,000. Now, that might seem a quite high amount of money, and in a European context, it would probably not affect an awful lot of people. If you applied that in Scotland, that would affect a significant number of businesses who are employing a lot of people and who are responsible for driving an awful lot of the food and production in Scotland. The real point I'm making there is that whilst we often cite the fact that Scotland has the lowest payment rates per hectare in Europe. We have the highest payment rates per business because we operate on big scales, because the landscape we have to operate on a big scale. So our payments per business are relatively high, or in fact very high on average in Scotland. So I think it goes back to Peter's point. It's about where you would pitch an absolute cap, or indeed whether you applied degressive payments and then had a final cap after that. Because at the end of the day, larger businesses can operate with economies of scale. They are generating lots of multipliers in local economies. They are employing people. There are people keeping people in remote or rural areas, etc. So the notion that, you know, big is bad and small is beautiful is, I think, misplaced often. And again, the management of a cap, where you'd set that cap and how you would recycle the funding from capping, have got to be managed very carefully. This bill doesn't talk about that. This bill only enables ministers to do something, but it doesn't set a policy agenda as to what that should be or how it should be done.
Colin, do you want to?
Can I turn that back on the panel then? So what do you think should be capped? And what do you think that funding should be used for? The Stability and Simplicity consultation talks about capping direct payments under Pillar 1 to use for pilot schemes, for example. Is that a position that you support? So what do you think should be capped, and what should that money then be used for?
Colin, I think it's a very interesting discussion. We're almost into the designing of the scheme again, the bill. So, but if I could ask people to keep it short on the answers there. Who'd like to head off on that? Yvonne.
Well, you could maybe start with the huge areas, big estates, maybe owned by Saudi people, the people from the Middle East, that there's not high production coming off them. That would be a start. And there used to be things like public ground that wasn't actually used for agriculture. I think that was sorted the last time. Was it not the airports were getting money through CAP? So that there would be areas like that you could actually probably have some quick wins in. Whether there would be a political will there to do it or not, it's a different matter. And I agree with Johnny when he says that, like, small's not beautiful, or it is beautiful, whatever, you know, but it's not. Scotland is so diverse in its agricultural and the output and the land that we really need bespoke solutions or support for the different areas. What's right for a large farm producing lots of fruit or what have you on the East Coast doesn't fit for Crofts on the Macker. It's two totally different areas.
Johnny mentioned correctly that Scotland has the highest average payment per business. It's a function not just of bigger businesses, but also concentrated land ownership in Scotland. And I think the question of capping needs to fit in with aims of the land reform in Scotland. It's going to have a big influence on the size of holdings if we continue rewarding very large holdings with uncapped funds.
Eleanor, and then I'm going to come back to you, Johnny.
I'm going to slightly skirt the issue, but I think if you're looking at having a landscape scale approach and you're looking at using the land use strategy for some of the climate change ambition and the targets that are set in the new climate change bill, it's worth noting that landscape scale could include quite a few landowners, but they're delivering quite a lot. And it's important to note where you put the cap and the impact of having any sort of capping or payment ceiling or digressive reduction. The impact of making that change on the local economy, on jobs, could be quite significant. So whilst I get there is an appetite for introducing these sort of things, it shouldn't be something that we do quickly and without consideration.
Johnny, just before I come back to you, maybe you could just bear in mind, I mean, I always wonder, some of the big organisations that do huge amounts for conservation are also in receipt of very large grants. I mean, the RSPB, for example, get large farming grants and use it very effectively in some cases for good conservation. Does that, a cap, would that concern them, do you think?
I think it probably would if they're also particularly in receipt of direct support payments rather than just Pillar 2 agri-environment payments. The point I was going to make, and this is a fundamental one about future policy, is that actually if we move away from an area-based payment and want to an action-based, activity-based payment, capping is no longer an issue. Capping becomes a non-issue if you're focusing on the actions on the ground rather than the areas that people declare.
Okay. Colin, are you happy? Angus. Okay. The next is a series of questions from panel members to specific members of, from the committee to specific panel members. I'm conscious that time is creeping on. So short focused answers would to short focused questions would work very well. Angus, I think yours is the first question.
Okay, thanks. This is a specific question for Yvonne White, basically asking you to expand on your earlier response to Richard Lyle. Basically, do you have any views on the implications of this bill in the Scottish crofting sector? And do you feel that the plans for the rural policy transition period will deliver benefits specifically for crofting?
We see the bill very much as a bridging bill, that we don't see it as something that's going to make much difference. Hopefully it should give a bit of continuity for the necessary period of time before a new agricultural bill is put into place. And I do think that it's important that we do have a timetable for a new agricultural bill that is more tailored to the specific needs of the crofting areas, as well as taking into consideration and, you know, the farming. But as we all know, the crofting it's quite unique. It's unique to Scotland. It's unique in Europe, and many people from out with the UK actually reference crofting, and they hold crofting up as a really excellent type of small-scale agriculture on marginal land that, however, I think a lot of the time we don't quite appreciate that and the culture that is attached to it. So that we've got big hopes, being optimistic that we will have, coming out of this, that we have a much better agricultural policy that will help retain people on the land in our marginal areas.
Okay, thanks for putting that in the record.
Emma.
Similar type of question probably for Chris about tenant farming. Does the bill have any specific implications for tenant farmers, and do you think that their plans for the rural policy transition period have been developed with specific needs or addressing tenant farmers?
There are measures in the bill that could benefit the tenanted sector. Some we've already covered, for example, moving away from area-based payments to activity-based payments. If the introduction of capping at a level that would result in a saving, and that saving could be used to start a support system for new entrants who are very limited at the moment in their support. So there are measures there that could help the tenanted sector. Going forward, I would hope that a bill looking at future policy would be able to give more consideration to the tenanted sector.
Mm-hmm. Probably for Lizzie, the issue of new entrants would be really specific for the next gen young farmers as well.
I mean, as has been previously mentioned, there's no timescale, if you know what I mean. So this is that sort of bridging bill as such until we get something more set in stone. So for me, it's if we do something quicker, that that there's going to be legislation or policy put in place quicker. If farmers in general know about it and can then adapt to change if they need to. And it's what Johnny keeps bringing up about 2030. It really isn't far away. And for farmers to adapt to change, it needs to be implemented sooner. And for myself, who I'm already involved in farming, so I'm not actually sort of a new entrant as such, but it is just a sort of bridging bill at the moment. Okay.
Maureen.
Thank you. And my question is to you, Eleanor. Do you think that the bill adequately provides for the wider rural needs, so beyond agriculture? So, for example, forestry or sustainability of rural communities and other aspects of rural development that we talk about in other areas?
I think in terms of doesn't change what's currently provided. It could go further to sort of highlight how they will continue to be provided for in the future, which is a common, I think, criticism of the bill, is that it's what we currently do and doing that for the rest of time. There is a sort of question around forestry and whether the ability to make changes to some definitions could impact on how we address the forestry question and increase the area that we need to increase. And again, with things like leader funding and various other schemes that we've had, how they sort of continue, whilst they can continue as they are, what happens to them and how do we change and make them better?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. John Finney. John, you've got the next question.
Okay, Convener. Good morning, panel. Thanks very much indeed for your answers thus far, and I'm sure continuing going ahead, indeed. There's been reference made to the environment in a number of the responses. The Scottish Government's declared that there's a climate emergency, and colleagues around the table now agree that there is such an emergency. We've heard from previous panels, and you may be aware that the references to the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, which closes for new applicants next year, and also potential changes to CAP, and that combined that they could see a backwards, be a retrograde step for environmental protection. Can I have your thoughts on that, please?
Who'd like to head off? Johnny? Oh, Yvonne.
I think everything I've said this morning has certainly referenced climate change as being a very important, if not the most important thing that society faces, let alone agriculture. So enabling farmers and crofters to contribute in a positive way to tackling and addressing those issues remains paramount to us. And therefore you need this bill to provide continuity in the first place, but then, as we've discussed, we need something beyond that to set a policy direction and an implementation thereafter. I think your question refers to that sort of continuity around things like existing agri-environment schemes, in that as things stand, 2020, there will be no new applications to the existing agri-environment climate scheme. There will be a rollover for those that would be coming to an end, but I think it's absolutely critical, and we've seen this in previous years. Every time you get a change in the CAP, there's usually this transition required to ensure that there is continuity. So this bill, in a way, allows that, or should allow that, to continue in a Scottish context rather than being in a European context under the CAP. And that's critical, because it's whether it's biodiversity, water quality or climate change issues for the environment. Given that farming and crofting account for 70+% of Scotland's land mass under management, we have a ridiculously important role to play in safeguarding and enhancing our environmental assets. So the continuity of things is important, and therefore this bill is important in that sense. It's not just about support payments for farm businesses, it's about ensuring the continuity of management under those agreements.
Okay, thanks. Perhaps before the other panel members respond, you say, Mr Hall, it should. I wonder if the panel members can view, does it?
I'm no lawyer, but I'm at risk of saying a non sequitur, i.e. it will. We don't know that. The hope is that if the bill is drafted and enacted in the way it should be, then yes, it will. But it all depends what ministers do with the powers conferred upon them. They might sit on their hands and do nothing going forward, and therefore that would be a concern. This bill's got to be used, the powers within the bill need to be used in the most positive and effective sense.
John, Yvonne, Christopher and Eleanor all want to come in and say, yes. Yvonne, you said no very quickly then, so do you want to come and then I'll bring the other two in?
You mentioned the agri-environmental climate schemes that were the good, or words to that effect, that my response is no, because the many people who would like to and who croft extensively, it's an extensive system that can't get into the schemes yet, that they're doing everything that probably the scheme would aspire to. So it's almost like it's that these schemes are like some sort of foil or cosmetic approach, and they lack meaning because they're not getting to everybody and the areas that they need the uptake from. And there's lots of reasons for that, and I know that this isn't the place to discuss the ins and outs of it, but very disappointing that there could be a much better uptake, which would benefit Scotland and, you know, generally.
Thank you.
I think it's important that the EEC scheme, the Agri-Environment Climate Change Scheme, can continue. There'll be plenty of examples across Scotland where there's environmental measures in place under that scheme that have been continued from previous schemes, going all the way back to SRDP and the I've forgotten the name of the previous one, but they largely had the same measures in them. They're continuing, and I hope they can continue. I think one of the problems with the EEC scheme that Yvonne touched on is that it has been competitive to get into, so it hasn't reached everybody. Looking at the bigger picture going forward, as farmers and land managers, we're responsible for the management of what is the world's biggest carbon sink, the soil and carbon and organic matter in the soil. That, to my mind, there are a lot of measures that farmers could be doing to improve carbon capture in the soil, and while there are examples of other countries having schemes to make sure farmers farm in a way to put carbon into the soil, it's something that we need to look at here going forward. As many people have said, that agriculture can be the solution to climate change rather than the problem.
As far as this bill, I think it would allow for current schemes to be continued. Once we're outside the EU, they can just be continued. And I imagine one possible modification could be on eligibility to widen out the scope for uptake, and possibly a tweak to some of the competitive nature of them. But in terms of how this sits, perhaps, with the Climate Change Emission Reduction Target Act that's gone through recently, it's something that we need to be aware of, that there are some significant commitments in there related to land use, whether that's whole farm action plans or the nitrogen accounts and the improvements in the land use strategy use. Whether the ambition of that act and the parts of it in the climate change plan sit with the parts of this bill and how we can move quicker is something that I think needs to be considered further.
Okay. John.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of the responses have touched on the way that this bill could deliver simplifications and improvements for land managers whilst maintaining environmental, animal welfare and food standards. It is about its relationship with other bits of legislation rather than it is an enabling piece of legislation after all. Do you have any suggestions of how it could deliver simplifications and improvements with regard to environmental, animal welfare and safety standards?
Who'd like to start off on that? I did say the danger was that if you all looked away, that it would be the last one who looked away. Eleanor, do you want to go then?
I think I mean, I'd probably leave it for the simplification task force to report on what they think is possible, but a lot of it seems to be down to inspection and the handling of the sort of paperwork behind these sorts of things to speed up the process. But I wouldn't want to...
Okay, Johnny, you wanted to come back.
If this bill could enable, and I think this addresses Yvonne's point to a degree as well, enable a shift in some of the resources from what are essentially competitive elements of the current agri-environment schemes and so on, to enable non-competitive things, so you have a greater uptake across a greater swathe of individuals, then I think that would be of major benefit. And I go back to the point I made earlier. I think there are certain measures that, on a non-competitive basis...
Mr. Hall, sorry to interrupt, could you maybe just explain the competitive nature of the element that you're talking about, please, just for clarification?
Well, the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, as we currently have it, is part of our Pillar 2, part of the Rural Development Programme, the SRDP, and the funding within that is available to all, but because the funding is limited, therefore applications are essentially assessed on a points basis, and points mean prizes, and by and large, as a rule, if you're big enough and in the right place, you'll get enough points. If you're not big enough and you're in the wrong place, you won't get the right points. So it doesn't matter how good your application might be, there's not enough funding to go around. So decisions have to be taken. It's a very difficult choice for Scottish Government, etc. But by and large, the participation rate in Agri-Environment Climate Scheme is nowhere near as good or as high as we would all like it to be. So an alternative approach would be to take some funding out of that, or to provide additional funding somewhere to operate some sort of non-competitive approach whereby every farm in Croft from a list of options could say, I could do the soil testing, nutrient management stuff to help improve carbon storage. They could do nutrient budgeting and things like that. They could do extensive grazing management plans in common grazings and upland areas for biodiversity benefit, as well as carbon storage, habitats and all the rest of it. We used to have something called land managers options, which were effectively that. We used to have something before that called environmentally sensitive areas, ESAs, which were geographic targeted funding, which did pretty much that as well. So a bit of a back to the future here in some ways, but then let's put some in some real practical, effective measures that farmers and crofters can work with, that they can fit into what their aspirations for operating their businesses, won't cost a whole heap of money, because we're talking about an allocation per farm business or whatever it might be, and that will add real value, not only in terms of how they operate and manage their land for the business point of view, but will offer an environmental bonus as well. And that is exactly where our steps to change argument is. So it would take a change in what we currently do. And back to the bill, does the bill enable that? It probably starts the piloting process of that, because that's clearly in there, but it doesn't provide for the effective rollout of that. And if we go back to the climate change plan, it's quite clear to me that every farmer and every crofter, if we're going to achieve agriculture's targets, will have to do everything everywhere. And that will soak up a lot of resources. And we need that funding if we're going to play our part.
John, do you have a brief follow-up?
No, just to say thank you for that comprehensive explanation.
Okay.
Yeah, that was good.
Does anyone else want to add briefly, or maybe we could move on? John, are you happy? We'll move on to the next question.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay. The next question is from Emma. Emma.
This bill has, it's proposing power to modify CAP legislation on public intervention and private storage aid. So I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts on that. And then I'll ask my second question at the same time, which is about fruit and vegetable producer organisations. In the last evidence session, Nigel Miller said that we have failed on the issue of producer organisations, and there is potential to bring producers together for development and to market their products. So I guess the issue is of public intervention, private storage, but also on how do we simplify and improve fruit and vegetable producer organisations.
Who'd like to head off on private storage? Christopher.
I think intervention is, it's good that there is the option in the bill. It might never be needed, But given the uncertainties that we face, the means to operate intervention should be there.
I would agree with Christopher on that.
Okay.
In extreme circumstances, we probably still need that in our armoury.
The second question was on producer groups. Would anyone like to go on that? Johnny, you...
Well, it's European legislation currently, and I think it's absolutely imperative that we continue to operate or able to operate producer organisations. They have worked very well in certain sectors. You look at soft fruit sector and how it's operated there. It allows more collective action by a number of growers so they're not being picked off as individuals. Certainly we as NFU Scotland would like to see the development of producer organisations into other sectors. If you look at the challenges that the beef sector is facing right now, one of the things that we would argue very strongly for is if we could operate more collaboratively in a formal sort of sense, so that the primary producer has a bit more power in that supply chain, because at the moment every individual is getting picked off as a price taker, and when we're facing a supply chain which is less than transparent to say the least, and you're dealing with some big processors and some big retailers, and the primary producer is the whipping boy or girl at the end of that supply chain. Producer organisations have the potential to strengthen the primary producer's role in the supply chain. So having that power and developing it into other sectors, not just fruit and veg, as we've seen it operate so far, I think is an important one.
And supporting dairy producers as well.
And it comes into the whole realms of contracts, dairy contracts and things like that, and producer groups in that sense. Absolutely.
Okay.
I think we're quite pushed on time, and I think that was quite a full answer. So I'm going to go to Peter. I know you've got a question.
Yeah, I mean, my question is on Section 8 and 9, the marketing standards, and it's quite a big part of the bill, actually. It speaks about classification criteria, it speaks about labelling, it speaks about various production methods, and we've already touched on the possibility or the potential for that to have an effect on the UK single market. So let's just park that one. But the Scottish Government outlined in a previous session that they would amend marketing standards on a case-by-case basis, they said, and that the bill would provide the flexibility for Scotland to either align standards with the UK or with the EU. So I wonder what the panel's thoughts are on that statement.
Who has thoughts on that? Eleanor?
I think it's important to consider the primary markets for a lot of what we produce. Don't have the exact figures to hand, but I know a lot of our sort of beef ends up and sheep end up in England first and foremost. It's important that we don't not that we can't have divergence from UK standards and EU standards. I imagine in terms of trade agreements, there's probably going to be quite a similarity, but it's important that we don't end up distorting the market of the UK as well. So that's not to say we can't be slightly different, but it's important we don't sort of change for the sake of changing.
In on that and bring Jamie.
In a very roundabout way, we absolutely want differentiation because we want to be able to sell our product as being Scotch and to be recognisable as that. But then within that, you want to the standard at which it's been produced, but then the marketing of that, which is another element, I think needs to be consistent across the UK if we're going to protect that internal UK market. I can see the logic behind the Scottish Government line that you just quoted, Peter, but I'd be concerned about how that works in practice. Operating different standards for different markets, whether they're more important at a European level for us or whether they're more important at a UK level for us. And that might end up being a bit of a messy area. But I think the principle's sound.
I mean, one of the issues that I have, when you start, going down different routes and having different standards, there's always a cost attached to that. There's a cost to the industry attached to that as well. Because you can have labelling issues, for instance, can be a costly issue if you have different standards of labelling. Just as one example.
I think we also need to be careful about differentiating between production standards and marketing standards. So, which is a point that Stuart Stevenson raised earlier on.
Yeah.
Jamie, did you want to come in on that particular point?
I did, and it falls on nicely from that, is that what we're not talking about here is differentiation in production standards. It specifically says in Section 8 that Scottish ministers may, by regulations, make provisions about products which are marketed in Scotland, not which are produced in Scotland. If you look at the list in Section 9, it includes things like olive oil, wine, etc., things that we don't make a lot of in Scotland. So my question, interestingly, also excludes pork and lamb, and I wonder if anyone had a view on that and why you think they're omitted from this in terms of standards. But could we end up in a scenario where products that we currently import from the EU or elsewhere would need to have different labelling to be sold in Scotland as a direct result of the powers listed in Section 8, which include powers to dictate presentation, labelling and packaging? And what effect would that have, more importantly, on those markets?
Who'd like to head off on that? Eleanor, did you want to?
I don't mind starting with it. And we already see it a bit if you want to export to the States. If you have a food product that you export, it needs a different set of labelling. So it's more about how it's marketed in Scotland. You're right. I'm not sure it would. It depends how different it ends up being. Some label changes can be so detailed that it's almost too expensive for a small producer to ever consider changing what they do. So in terms of products currently sold in Scotland, it might have an impact on that. And it depends from a domestic situation. If the bulk of your product is actually exported, it could mean that it's cheaper to export it elsewhere, just outside Scotland, because that's what your current labelling requirement is. So it depends on the level of change, really.
Can I just throw something in here, which is my question about the bill allows Scottish ministers to change carcass classification. So we could end up with a different classification of carcasses in Scotland to the rest of the UK and indeed Europe. Would that be beneficial? Do you think that's a sensible thing to have in the bill? Do we need it? Who'd like to?
It's obviously part of that retained EU law thing, because at some point there's carcass classification rules set at a European level, and we have to absorb those back into Scots law. Whether we then change them, which this bill could enable, that becomes the policy choice. But having the ability to, otherwise that European standard becomes frozen. That's the whole point of this bill, essentially.
Okay, so it's not an issue on common frameworks for trade. Christopher, you want to?
At the moment, we don't know the details of any trade deals post-Brexit. So the important part of the bill is to allow flexibility for a future situation.
Maybe that one will have to wait and see. And because I'm conscious of time, I do actually have the final question, which is, as everyone knows, as part of the current system, there's a lot of data collected, which allows the future management of agricultural holdings. And there is a very real argument that as money is being given by the public, it's right that data is collected and is available to the Scottish Government and to other people beyond that. Do we think the data provisions within the bill and the collection of data provisions within the bill are reasonable? And a yes/no answer, if anyone wants to give it, would be very helpful.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Great, and I love ending on a note of consensus. It is a great thing to do. And I am actually going to thank you all now as panel members for coming and giving evidence. And I would normally suspend the meeting to allow you to depart, but because of the way the agenda is, I'm actually going to ask you to stay seated for the agenda item 2, which I'm sure after some of the comments that you made this morning you will find interesting. So this is the consideration of one negative procedure statutory instrument as detailed on the agenda. I confirm to the committee that no motions to annul or representations have been received in relation to this instrument. Does anyone on the committee wish to make comment on this instrument?
Thank you, Convener. Yes, no, I'm content with the content. However, as a layperson and not a lawyer, I would ordinarily, and I imagine others will do likewise, head straight to the explanatory note to see what it was all about. Now, this covers a wide range of issues, and it's 28 sections. The explanatory note concludes with the following sentence, if I may put it on the record, Convener, and that is, a full impact assessment has not been produced for these regulations as no significant impact on the private, voluntary or public sector is foreseen. I have to say, I find that totally inadequate. Totally inadequate. They're almost alluding, it's like hedging their bets a wee bit there. There are you either take the trouble to make an assessment, or an assessment isn't required and because you don't think there's going to be significant. I wonder if there are ways that we can perhaps get a more comprehensive response in relation to this legislation, because not least because we know that there is a considerable weight of secondary legislation coming our way, and
okay. I mean, I think it would be entirely appropriate if the committee was in agreement is to write to the government and say that statements such as that aren't particularly helpful in the consideration of instruments such as this by the committee. Jamie, do you want to make a comment?
A brief point, and maybe it's a point of clarification, but the instrument was laid on the 3rd of December, but came into force on the 14th, which obviously was a couple of days ago. I appreciate there is a letter from the government explaining the rationale, but it's just maybe to note that the regulations have already come into force, and we've been asked, in light of the conversation we've just had earlier today, that would, in normal circumstances, be unacceptable to us.
Okay, I think it appears that the committee would feel it appropriate to write to the government to ask them to clarify this situation and to make sure that we have more information than this when we're considering instruments in the future. Is that agreed by the committee? Thank you. I am now going to suspend the meeting as we go into private session. I know some committee members have to leave, but I would ask committee members to be back in their chairs in 5 minutes, please. Thank you very much, and I formally suspend the meeting.